The disease known as the Plague has been stalking humanity for over 5,000 years, and there have been many outbreaks. In fact, there have been 3 pandemics caused by the bacillus bacterium Yersinia Pestis. The first was in the 6th century. It devastated the Byzantine Empire and was known as the Plague of Justinian. The third began in China in the mid-19th century and quickly spread throughout the world. But it is the plague that began in 1346 which killed more than 50 million people in just 7 years that we refer to as the Black Death. The Middle Ages was a time of superstition, religious fanaticism, and ignorance, and so they thought it was the end of the world. In reality, it was the largest pandemic in the history of humanity. Welcome to Medieval Madness. The Yersinia Pestis bacterium spreads between wild rodents in the areas where their population is at its most dense. These areas are known as plague reservoirs. The problems arise when rodents that live in places inhabited by humans become infected. The house rat, also called the black rat or the ship's rat, likes to live near to people, unlike the brown and grey rats, and this is what makes it dangerous. It usually takes up to 2 weeks for the disease to kill off a colony of contaminated rats, making it difficult for their parasitic fleas to find new hosts. But eventually, the fleas have no choice but to abandon the dying rodents. Then, hungry and desperate, they turn on humans. A flea which carries the plague bacteria can infect a human victim in 2 different ways. As it bites its host, the flea passes the bacteria into the bloodstream just before it starts to feed. Or because there are bacteria in the feces of the infected flea, it can be passed on through any cuts or abrasions in the host's skin. It's not known where the Black Death originated from, but it is possible that it began in South Asia, where wild rats transmitted it into human settlements. The plague then spread south through China and India and on through the trading routes. Caravans carrying grain and furs are the perfect environment for housing rodents and their fleas. The main line of transmission seems to have been overland into Eastern Europe and by sea routes into Italy. Kaffa, which is now in present-day Ukraine, was established by the Maritime Republic of Genoa in 1266, and was a main port for their merchant ships with the agreement by the Khan of the Golden Horde. But the relationship between the Italian traders and their Turco-Mongol hosts was always tense. In 1307, the Mongols arrested any Italians living in Sarai, the capital of the Golden Horde, and they besieged Kaffa. The Genoese had to abandon their city. But the new Khan Osbeg welcomed the Italians back with open arms, and by the 1340s Kaffa was a thriving port once more. In 1345, a further change of Khan meant Kaffa was under siege again. It ended when the Mongol forces were struck down by an epidemic of plague. And in the first recorded instance of biological warfare, the Mongols began to catapult the infected dead over Kaffa's defensive walls. Gabriele de Musi, an Italian notary from Piacenza, described how the Mongols, who he called Tartars, died, quote, as soon as the disease appeared on their bodies, swellings in the armpit or groin caused by coagulating humours, followed by a putrid fever. They lost interest in the siege, but ordered corpses to be placed in catapults and lobbed into the city. And soon the rotting corpses tainted the air and poisoned the water supply. The stench was so overwhelming. All that the inhabitants of Kaffa could do was watch as the putrid bodies fell from the sky. They dumped as many as they could into the sea, but it was too late. Fleeing on their boats, the Genoese took the plague with them, first to Constantinople and then on to Italy, where it then spread out in all directions across Europe into Austria, Germany, and the kingdoms of the Western Mediterranean. From there, it went north through France. By the spring of 1348, it had reached the papal seat of Avignon, by June, Paris. By the summer, it was in England, and by the summer of the following year, it had reached Wales and Ireland before spreading to Scotland in 1350. The symptoms of the disease remained consistent throughout North Africa, the Middle East, and Europe, and were manifested in different forms. The first and most common was the enlargement of the lymph nodes from the flea bite site. There are lymph nodes all over the body, but with plague, the painful swelling occurs in the groin and the armpits, and sometimes in the neck, these being the largest nodes and nearer to the surface of the body. The swellings, or buboes, are where the name bubonic plague comes from. The onset of the disease begins with a sudden coldness, a prickling of the skin, not unlike pins and needles, chronic fatigue, and depression. As the buboes began to form, the unfortunate victim would be suffering from a high fever and an increasingly painful headache. Sometimes little blisters appeared on the body and there was a mottled discoloration of the skin. The victim might slip in and out of consciousness, being disorientated when awake. Those who contracted the bubonic plague could hang on for up to a week, some even recovered. But sadly, 80% of those infected died. Another way in which the plague manifested itself was by attacking the lungs, causing breathing difficulties, chest pains, and the hacking up of blood and phlegm. Like pneumonia, this pneumonic plague was spread quite easily by the coughing of an infected person. It's also possible that the bacteria could be inhaled from the flea feces that was on clothing or bedding. For those poor souls, death occurred within a couple of days due to a lack of oxygen and heart failure. The bacteria are very adaptable and can enter the bloodstream, causing septicemic plague, poisoning the blood and causing death within 24 hours. It can also get into the skin or into the gastrointestinal tract. Frighteningly, the plague can attack our bodies in several different ways. The reason there was such a large mortality rate in the first 5 years of the Black Death was probably because there were so many different types of plague, taking all of these different forms, all at the same time. So, although it arrived from the bacteria-ridden fleas, it could then become pneumonic. This was especially important in northern areas of Central Asia and Europe, where the bacteria could live on through the colder months and be spread person to person, when fleas were not prevalent. The Europe of the mid-14th century was not the unenlightened and backwards continent that many believe. Yes, it was devout and therefore superstitious, but it was also well populated, mobile, and sophisticated in many ways. People from all walks of life representing many types of business were on the roads, from soldiers to pilgrims, merchants to bureaucrats, and there was nowhere richer in commerce and trading than the cities in the north of Italy. Although they were crowded, for example, Florence had a population of 10,000 in 1347, they were also wealthy places to live, attracting people from all around Europe. They were, in essence, the kind of place that a disease is going to love. And it was in the autumn of that year that the mysterious and terrible plague arrived, carried in the blood and on the breath of the sailors returning from the Black Sea in the east. No one could have predicted it coming, and the Italian cities of the north were caught by surprise. Gabriele de Mussi described how the contagious pestilence poisoned every city and every settlement. How, quote, death entered through the windows, and when one person contracted the illness, he infected his whole family, and those preparing to bury the dead were seized in the same way. Italy was on the front line of an incomprehensible disease that would threaten everything they held dear, from family to religion. and no one was prepared for the horror and speed at which it spread. In just 3 months, 20% of the population was dead. An explanation for the plague that was circulating was the poison thesis, and this was at odds with the usual medieval belief that illness was caused by an imbalance of the 4 humours. Gentile de Foligno was one of the first physicians to suggest this as a cause, stating that, quote, "Poisonous vapours have been contracted by the breathing out and breathing in of the air, meaning that the contagion would be passed on from man to man and region to region." Although he did mention other reasons for the cause of plague as being eclipses, a conjunction of the planets, and stinking putrefaction, brought on by winds from stagnant pools of water, animal dung, and rotting bodies. Gentile soon realised that the plague was unstoppable, saying that the pestilence was, quote, "more awful than anything seen before. No disease of comparable malignancy has ever been witnessed." Gentile tried his best to treat the sick. He advised that they should not lie on their backs when sleeping and that they should eat lettuce. He also applied a mix of gum resin, the roots of white lilies, and dried human feces to those victims with advanced symptoms, hoping that the body might be able to somehow heal itself. Of course, the treatment failed, and sadly, Gentile succumbed to the Black Death himself on the 8th of June, 1348. For Christians, Muslims, and Jews alike, prayer would be the first offence against what seemed to most to be the last judgment. Perhaps medicine could help. Standard cures at the time called for herbs and spices that would block the poisonous air and strengthen the body. Pungently smelling and strongly flavoured ingredients were popular, such as so-called hot spices like nutmeg, ginger, and coriander. Many physicians catered to the wealthy and prescribed herbal remedies that contained expensive ingredients such as ambergris, which is especially pungent. Ambergris is produced in the digestive system of sperm whales before being vomited up into the ocean. This rare substance is still highly sought after and used in perfumes today. The burning of wormwood was recommended and vinegar was used a lot, soaked into sponges or cloth before being held up to the face. The Italians realised quickly that there was no cure for the pestilence and were only left with the church and their faith in God in the hope of salvation. But religion proved to be of little protection against the plague. The holy men who were brave enough to tend to the sick and hear their dying confession often became victims themselves. In Piacenza alone, 60 priests died, leaving the surviving clergy too afraid to go out and administer the sacraments and last rites. Ignorance and self-preservation reigned. Some believed that the Black Death could be spread just by looking at someone who was infected. Others thought that it was caught simply by thinking about it. No one knew what to do. In the city of Siena, Agnolo di Tudor, a shoemaker and tax collector, described how, quote, "Father abandoned child, wife, husband, one brother, another, and so they died, and none could be found to bury the dead for money or friendship. Members of the household brought their dead to a ditch without a priest. And in many places in Siena, great pits were dug and piled deep with the multitude of the dead. And I, Agnolo di Tudor, called the Fat, buried my 5 children with my own hands. And there were those who were so sparsely covered in earth that the dogs dragged them forth and devoured many bodies throughout the city." Giovanni Boccaccio of Florence also told how, quote, "Brother abandoned brother, and the uncle his nephew, and the sister her brother, and very often the wife her husband. But what was even worse, and quite incredible, was that fathers and mothers refused to see and tend their sick children as if they had not been theirs." These are descriptions of a society in complete collapse. No one knew what to do or how to react. It was as though the apocalypse was upon them. As the bonds of humanity began to break apart, life for the medievals began to fail. Animals were left unattended, crops were left to decay in the fields. In Siena, as the local leaders and lawmakers died, the courts were closed and there was no order in the streets. Business ground to a halt, the bakeries were closed and there was no bread. The building of Siena Cathedral stopped. In fact, the nave remains unfinished to this day, as work never resumed, even after the plague had left. In the city and suburbs of Siena, 80,000 people died. Pits were being dug to bury the dead, but demand was so high that bodies weren't being removed and sanitation was non-existent. In Venice, the death toll was 90,000. In Florence, the city lost half of its population. And inevitably, in a world where everyone expected to die at any moment, the people began to live each day as though it were their last. Italian society fell into moral ruin. Abandoned houses became common property and were taken by any stranger who came along. Giovanni Boccaccio wrote of how the people, quote, believed that drinking excessively, enjoying life, going about singing and celebrating, satisfying in every way the appetites as best one could, laughing and making light of everything that happened was the best medicine for such a disease. So they practiced to the fullest what they believed, by going from one tavern to another all day and night, drinking to excess, and they would often make merry in private homes, doing everything that pleased or amused them the most. Even the priests, monks, and nuns enjoyed themselves, and none worried about spending and gambling. Many ended their lives on the public streets. He went on to describe how, quote, things had reached such a point that the people who died were cared for as we care for goats today. So many corpses would arrive in front of a church every day, and at every hour, that the amount of holy ground for burials was certainly insufficient for the ancient custom of giving each body its individual place. When all the graves were full, huge trenches were dug in all of the cemeteries of the churches, and into them the new arrivals were dumped by the hundreds, and they were packed in there with dirt, one on top of another, like a ship's cargo, until the trench was filled. Another chronicler noted that, quote, more bodies were put on top of the corpses with a little more dirt over those. Thus they put layer upon layer, just like when one puts layers of cheese in a lasagna. The rest of Europe readied itself for the oncoming plague, and it was little comfort that they had been alerted in advance. Many didn't take the horror stories that were brought back home by travellers and pilgrims seriously. Nevertheless, the Black Death carried on with its deadly march, and by the spring of 1348, it had arrived in the south of France. Many believed that the Catholic Church had failed the people, and there now appeared a group of extremists as a consequence of that. Known as the Flagellants, they made a direct challenge on the power of the Church, believing that the Black Death was the wrath of God. At a time that was so religious, almost to the point of fanaticism, some thought that God was punishing mankind by sending pestilence, who was named as one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Wasn't this type of disease the business of an angry god? Didn't he punish the Egyptians with a plague? So men, women, and children banded together and marched barefoot from town to town chanting prayers. Some wore hair shirts and beat themselves bloody with whips in an act of religious penance. The English historian Robert of Avesbury described them as, quote, each wearing a hood painted with a red cross front and back, and carried a whip with 3 thongs. Each thong had a knot in it with something sharp like a needle stuck through the middle. As they walked, they sang a Christian litany, and one after another they struck themselves with these whips on their naked and bloody bodies. It was said that the flagellants beat themselves so violently that their blood splattered the walls of the buildings as they passed. It was an act of contrition, a way to show the suffering that Jesus had gone through to save them from their sins. And how could God ignore such a powerful act? Surely he would now prevent this terrible affliction from coming for them. As the flagellants passed through the towns, their theatrical processions drew in a great many spectators who were also hoping for redemption. This sort of DIY form of Catholicism alarmed the church, who believed that the devotees were not only insane, but dangerous. It was the last thing they needed in the middle of a plague epidemic. Of course, for all of their faith, the expectations of the flagellants came to nothing. If anything, their behaviour would have helped to spread the plague even more rapidly. So what was it that God was so angry about? Could it be the corruption of the Catholic Church in Europe? Others thought God was angry at all the war that raged throughout the continent. France and England were continually at war, as were Germany and Italy. Many of the Italy city-states were even at war with one another, and war meant pillaging, atrocities, and bloodshed. Could it be that God was punishing the Christians for not succeeding during the Crusades and purging the Holy Lands of what they believed to be the Muslim heretics? Maybe it was because Christian Europe had allowed the Jews to live in their lands. After all, what sin could be worse than denying the true God? Weren't they the agents of the devil? Maybe that's why God was mad. Therefore, Jews were accused of plotting to destroy Christians throughout Europe, and it was believed that the best way to save all God-fearing men from the plague was to either convert, exile, or exterminate the Jewish population. And so the pogroms began. Jews were dying from the Black Death, but Christians claimed that they were dying at a lesser rate than themselves. And though it's hard to know if this was true, it is possible because of the cleaning practices that were required by Jewish law, such as the washing of one's hands several times throughout the day. As a general rule, most medievals could go a lifetime without washing their hands, whereas Jewish law states that hands have to be washed before and after meals, after using the bathroom, and upon awakening in the morning. In general, the Jewish neighborhoods of towns and cities had far better sanitary conditions than the other areas. Maybe these higher sanitary standards helped to preserve the Jewish population through this terrible time. But even if the mortality rates among Jews were considerably less than those of other faiths, the death rate among them due to the plague was still shocking. Although consecutive popes proclaimed that the Jews were not to blame for the Black Death and should be protected, the situation had become so unmanageable and the people so desperate for someone to blame that the word of a godly man, even one as powerful as the Pope, held no sway. A scapegoat was sought, and rumours began to circulate that the source of pestilence had originated in the water, someone poisoning the wells. In the French towns of Carcassonne and Narbonne, in the spring of 1348, Jews were dragged from their homes. They were said to be in possession of certain powders, and accused of poisoning the drinking water. Many Jews were tortured, and there were daily burnings at the stake. At its most simple, the plague was an opportunity for many Christians in debt to Jewish moneylenders to settle their debts by murdering their creditors. For some, it was an opportunity that they could not pass up on, and one that they had been wishing for. In many places, Jewish communities were wiped out before the Black Death even arrived. In Freiburg, Munich, Nuremberg, and in other large German towns, Jews were either exiled or burned. In 1349, in Basel, Switzerland, the entire community of Jews were burned, and in the same year in Worms in Germany, the whole Jewish population, desperate and afraid, committed mass suicide. The largest Jewish community in Europe was also in Germany, in a town called Mainz, and there they fought back against the Christian assault, killing over 200 of their attackers. But revenge was swift and brutal. On the 24th of August, 1349, over 6,000 Jews were slaughtered in Mainz. By 1350, the Jewish people who had survived the ravages of the Black Death died anyway at the hands of the mobs. The communities in the Belgian cities of Brussels and Antwerp were decimated. By the year 1390, most of the Jewish communities of Germany, France, and England had completely disappeared. There were over 19,000 Jews in Frankfurt, Germany in 1350. By the year 1400, there were less than 10. Sadly, this story is the same throughout Western Europe. The impact that the plague had on European Jews is immeasurable. It caused the acceleration of the influx of Jews into Eastern Europe, especially Poland, where they were welcomed and protected by King Casimir III the Great. Strangely, Poland, although landlocked, was not as affected by plague as the rest of Europe, and it only lost a quarter of its inhabitants. Western Europe had been a centre of Jewish life for more than 400 years, and now through ugly and horrific xenophobia, this was no longer the case. Rome was no longer the centre of Christendom. For many years, the popes had resided in Avignon, which was now a centre for art, politics, and theology. The papal court was a huge concern, with between 600 and 700 people, a place of patronage and power. And at this time, it was Pope Clement VI who held authority. Surely, as God's representative here on earth, he would save the people. He actively organised extra church services and religious processions that were meant to lessen the strength of the coming plague by reducing God's anger. But this had no effect. Scared and bewildered, Clement turned to his talented physician, Guy de Chauliac. Guy was a firm believer in the miasma theory, a belief that diseases were caused by noxious air. He advised the Pope to shut himself away from everyone. He recommended that he, quote, thin the blood with bloodletting, strengthen the heart with fruits and good-smelling things, and purify the air with fire. Pope Clement followed Guy's instructions and isolated himself from everyone, including his servants, and constantly stayed between two huge log fires. Afraid for his own safety and wishing to flee the city, Guy stayed because he wanted to avoid getting a bad reputation. He worked ceaselessly to treat the sick, but he had to admit that, quote, the physicians could give no help at all. They achieved nothing. For previous plagues there were some remedies. For this one, nothing. Although he said that he, quote, preserved himself as best I could. Nonetheless, toward the end of the mortality, I fell into a continuous fever, with an aposteme on the groin. Inevitably, Guy had caught the disease, and amazingly, he treated himself by incising the buboes. He later wrote, and I was sick for nearly 6 weeks, and I was in such great danger that all of my friends believed that I would die. And the aposteme ripened and healed, and I escaped by God's command. After his remarkable recovery, Guy worked ceaselessly to try and find a cause and a cure for the pestilence, performing autopsies on the dead. Miraculously, both Pope Clement and his court physician, Guy de Chauliac, had somehow managed to survive the Black Death. But outside, at least half the people of Avignon died. At one point, 7,000 houses in the city lay empty, and in the suburbs it was even more. 11,000 people were buried in just 6 weeks. In the end, Avignon lost half of its population and 1/3 of its cardinals. With so many dead, the Pope had to order new graveyards to be consecrated. The piles of rotting corpses were becoming such a problem that he even consecrated the River Rhone so that bodies could be thrown into it. It was quite clear that even the heart of Christendom had not been spared. As the plague made its way north, King Philip VI of France requested a report from the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Paris. He wanted to know the cause of this terrible plague that was heading their way. In what was considered to be the most up-to-date scientific information available at that time, the report stated that the first cause was that, quote, "In the year of our Lord 1345, at precisely 1 hour past noon, on the 20th day on the month of March, there was a major conjunction of 3 higher planets in Aquarius, and that a conjunction of 2 planets, namely Mars and Jupiter, brings about a great pestilence in the air. Secondly, the cause appeared to be because of a, quote, corruption of the air. At the same time as the conjunctions arose, that was spread and multiplied by frequent gusts of thick, wild and southerly winds. Thus the corrupted air, when it is breathed in, penetrates to the heart and corrupts the substance of the spirit. And the faculty recommended that, quote, one should humbly turn to God, keep far away from the glare of the sun, and when the air becomes excessively hot, it can be improved by pouring out cold water, furnishing the rooms with roses and violets, making sure that everything eaten and drunk is cold, and to be cautious of physical exercise and bathing." Regardless of the corrupted air, the plague was now spreading all over northern Europe. By the summer of 1348, the Black Death had travelled across the Channel and attacked Britain's southern ports. Of the 5 to 6 million people that lived there, 90% of them resided in the countryside, working on the land. For centuries, serfs had paid rent to their lords for their small holdings. For many, life was hard. Work was backbreaking, and for very little reward, most were just scratching a living. The aftermath of the Black Death would see their lives change in quite unexpected ways. It's not surprising that the port of Bristol was one of the first major towns to be affected. It was the second largest city in Britain and a major trading hub. The chronicler Henry Knighton noted that, quote, "The whole strength of the town of Bristol perished, as it was surprised by sudden death, for few kept their beds more than 2 or 3 days, or even half a day." Another named Geoffrey the Baker wrote that, quote, "The plague came to England and first began in the towns and ports, and finally it spread all over England and so wasted the people that it made the country quite void of inhabitants, so that there were almost none still left alive." In Suffolk, in the large village of Walsham-le-Willows, the deaths began in 1348, and over a 4-month period left only 600 survivors from a once thriving community of between 12 to 1500 people. The pestilence moved at a tremendous pace, spreading at a speed of 5 miles a day. In a period of between 6 to 8 months, it was in Scotland, and by 1350 it was in Scandinavia, the German countries, and had reached Russia. One man from Walsham who watched the deaths begin in May 1349 was Nicholas Denny. He could only look on as he first lost his older brother William, closely followed by his wife, and then his 3 children. Then his mother also perished. This story is heard again and again in many villages across England. In Jarrow, 80% of the people died. Daily life as it had once been came to a grinding halt. The darkness, shock, and grief must have been horrific. Nicholas was left with his brother's house and 3.5 acres of his land, as well as 5 acres from his mother. He was 3 times richer than he had been before the plague arrived. The world had changed, and many other peasant families in England were able to benefit in the aftermath of the plague. There was a shortage of labourers, craftspeople and servants, so higher wages and cheaper rents could be demanded. Who was going to cut the corn, mend the roof, wait on the great lords and ladies? The old order was changing, and the establishment was under threat. Many were bound to their lords by law, but left their manors to go and work elsewhere for better pay. Who was going to stop them? Panicking, in 1349, in the middle of the pandemic, King Edward III passed a law that demanded workers accept wages at the same level of 5 or 6 years earlier. The freedom of peasants to move about and find the most profitable work was limited, and fines were given. But the laws failed due to an overwhelming change in the attitude of a now unwilling working class. Many survivors from the rural areas were now drawn to the towns and cities in search of better prospects and new beginnings, as serfdom faded away. The Black Death has been called a turning point in history. The feudal system had collapsed, respect for the class structure was weakened, and the so-called academic experts were no longer believed. Against the odds, Europe had survived, and although the plague came back in waves every decade or so, the people grew to live with it. In Europe, the survivors began to rebuild their lives. The Pope gave thanks to God and called for pilgrims to begin to travel again. In Italy, which was once at the forefront of the epidemic, there was such a change in society, culture, and religion that it led to the Renaissance, one of the greatest outpourings of art, literature, science, and architecture that humanity has ever seen. It was probably the worst century to have been alive, but humanity had survived the Black Death. It also survived regular outbreaks of the plague for a further 300 years. Even today, we can't actually explain what the Black Death was. One theory is that it was a lethal hybrid of the hemorrhagic and bubonic plagues, but for now, the disease remains a mystery. Thank you so much for watching our documentary on the Black Death. Please do leave a comment if you'd like to see more videos in this format, and any ideas of content that you'd like us to cover. Subscribe to the channel if you've enjoyed this, because we do release a video every Friday, and I hope to see you all soon. Cheers!